At first light, a sanitation worker slowed on a narrow turnout where frost glazed fallen leaves, noticing a dark coat folded too carefully beside a drainage culvert. The air still, the radios quiet, the sense unmistakable that December had surrendered a secret preserved by cold and time. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The place sat just off a two-lane road outside West Warwick, Rhode Island, where mill towns taper into woods and backyards bleed into state land. Police arrived with measured steps, sealing a small perimeter, logging temperatures, wind, and ground conditions. The body belonged to 22-year-old Melissa Anne Carver, identified by a wallet found inside her purse, dry despite overnight frost. She had been reported missing 3 days earlier, on December 21, 1995, after failing to return from a late shift at a retail store near the river. The discovery carried the quiet weight familiar to investigators who had seen winter cases before, where cold preserves facts but delays answers. Melissa had grown up in the area, the daughter of a machinist and a school secretary, graduating from a local high school before taking classes part-time at a community college. Friends described her as cautious, practical, and anchored by routine. She lived in a small apartment off Main Street, decorated with thrift store furniture, and a tabletop artificial tree she planned to put up that week. Her plans for Christmas included a simple dinner with her parents and a drive to see holiday lights. There was no history of substance abuse, no known enemies, no pattern of risk-taking. The missing persons report noted her punctuality and the absence of any prior disappearances. The scene yielded little drama and many details. Tire impressions were faint but measurable, a narrow tread consistent with a compact sedan. A cigarette butt lay several feet away, partially crushed, later catalogued and bagged. There were no obvious signs of a struggle in the immediate area. The medical examiner documented hypothermia exposure after death and signs consistent with manual restraint, careful language used in the preliminary report to avoid speculation. Time of death was estimated within a 12-hour window on the night she vanished, consistent with weather data and insect absence. The autopsy would later clarify cause, but early indicators pointed to homicide. Investigators reconstructed Melissa's final day. She clocked out at 9:47 p.m., purchased a coffee at a nearby gas station, and drove toward home. A store camera captured her leaving alone, keys in hand, the parking lot wet from melting snow. Her car, a blue compact hatchback, was found the next morning parked legally on her street, doors locked, no sign of forced entry. Inside, her work apron lay folded on the passenger seat. Nothing appeared stolen. The winter quiet of the neighborhood offered no witnesses willing or able to recall anything unusual. The days before Christmas pressed the department with limited staffing and competing calls, yet the case drew attention. Flyers appeared on telephone poles and store windows, her photograph framed by seasonal wreaths that felt suddenly out of place. Local papers ran restrained articles, emphasizing the unknowns and urging tips. The state police offered assistance, bringing in a mobile evidence unit and analysts accustomed to cold cases that start cold from the first hour. Interviews followed a procedural arc. Family members provided timelines and phone records. Coworkers described a normal shift, a brief exchange with a customer asking about a return policy, nothing memorable. A former boyfriend was located out of state, his alibi verified through employment records and travel receipts. Neighbors were canvassed twice, once immediately and again after the holidays, when routines returned and memories settled. A dog walker recalled headlights idling near the culvert around 10:30, uncertain of the date. The detail was logged, not elevated. Physical evidence moved slowly through labs. The cigarette butt yielded a partial profile unsuitable for immediate comparison. Fibers from Melissa's coat matched common upholstery found in many vehicles. Soil on her shoes matched the culvert area, offering no indication of a secondary scene. The medical examiner's final report listed cause of death as asphyxia due to manual compression, manner homicide, with no evidence of sexual assault. The phrasing mattered, narrowing investigative paths and informing public statements. As December closed, attention drifted. New Year's came with resolutions and snowfall, tips tapered. Detectives compiled binders, labeled tapes, and entered names into systems that would later change formats. The case remained open, reviewed quarterly, then annually. Each Thanksgiving, a brief note appeared in the local press marking the anniversary, respectful and spare. Years passed, technology advanced. In 2008, the department revisited unsolved homicides, pulling boxes from a climate-controlled room beneath the courthouse. Melissa's file was intact, meticulous. The cigarette butt was retested with improved methods, producing a stronger profile. It did not match any offender in the state database. The result was logged and archived again, the case still unresolved. Investigators documented alternative theories without commitment. A transient population near the river was examined and eliminated through timelines and shelter records. Delivery routes were mapped for vehicles that routinely passed the culvert, narrowing windows by traffic counts and fuel receipts. Phone records from public payphones were requested, revealing patterns too broad to isolate a suspect. Weather reports were cross-referenced with patrol logs to test sightings against snow squalls and plow schedules. Community meetings were held with a careful tone. Detectives explained process, urged patience, and resisted speculation. The holiday season returned each year with candles at vigils and brief mentions on local radio. Melissa's parents aged in place, keeping a box of letters and copies of articles on a dining room sideboard. They met investigators annually, reviewing the same facts, asking the same questions, receiving the same honest answers. By the mid-2000s, the case had become a training example, cited for scene discipline and evidence preservation. Younger officers learned the value of notes written clearly and bags sealed properly. The cigarette butt remained a promise deferred, stored under conditions designed for a future not yet imagined. The culvert was cleaned by the town, then left alone, unmarked, traffic passing without pause. Budget constraints shaped choices. Overtime requests were denied, then approved for short bursts. A regional task force compared notes with neighboring states, looking for patterns among unsolved winter homicides of young women. None aligned. Melissa's life remained singular, her routines precise, her end unexplained. The quiet endurance of the file mirrored the town itself. Mills closed, roads were repaved, and a new courthouse annex opened with brighter lights and colder rooms. Evidence lockers were audited. Melissa's items were checked, resealed, and logged again. The calendar turned through Thanksgivings marked by early darkness and radio appeals for cautious driving, a familiar backdrop to a case that refused to fade. Investigators noted small advances that did not yet cohere. A vehicle sighting was re-evaluated with improved mapping. A former resident submitted a tip decades late, sincere but unverifiable. Each lead was treated the same, entered, assessed, and closed. The work was methodical, unglamorous, and necessary. It set the conditions for an answer not yet available, waiting in the margins of science and time. By the end of the first decade, the case rested in a category known to detectives who specialize in patience. Not cold, not active, but ready. Policies changed, databases expanded, and standards tightened. The department preserved the integrity of what had been collected in 1995, understanding that the smallest artifact could later matter. For Melissa Anne Carver, the winter of her disappearance remained fixed in memory, a reminder that careful work at the beginning is an investment whose return may come long after the snow melts. The narrative at this stage was incomplete by design. Investigators had built a foundation of facts, preserved through seasons and administrative change. The town waited without spectacle. The file waited with intention. What followed would depend on tools not yet fully formed and on a decision, years away, to look again with new eyes. For now, the record closed on a pause, not an ending. Snow fell again, traffic thinned, and December passed. The unanswered questions remained catalogued, the evidence intact, the promise implicit that procedure, when honored, can carry truth forward until it is finally called upon. That promise would shape the years ahead, guiding reviews, authorizing tests, and sustaining hope without haste. The winter record remained open, steady, and prepared for the moment progress would finally arrive. That moment was not yet visible, but it was approaching, quietly, lawfully, inevitably, in due course. By 1999, the investigative environment had changed in ways subtle to the public but decisive inside police buildings. Rhode Island agencies consolidated records, digitizing reports once typed on carbon paper. Melissa Carver's file entered a searchable system, allowing cross-reference with arrests, vehicle registrations, and latent evidence from other cases. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit treated the process like an audit, checking chain of custody, verifying seals, confirming that nothing had degraded. The cigarette butt, the fibers, the soil samples, and the clothing were all present, each item logged with a care that reflected lessons learned from earlier decades. The review emphasized timelines. Melissa's movements were reconstructed minute by minute, using store receipts, traffic light cycles, and average travel times measured during winter conditions. Analysts drove the route at night in December, noting sightlines and places a car could idle without drawing attention. The culvert where she was found lay within a short detour from her direct path home, reachable in less than 2 minutes. That fact reinforced the prevailing theory that she encountered someone she recognized or someone who presented as non-threatening, enough to stop briefly without alarm. Investigators examined vehicles common to the area in 1995, focusing on models with narrow tread patterns consistent with the impressions photographed at the scene. Registration records narrowed the field to several hundred cars. Most owners were eliminated through alibis, relocation records, or death certificates. The process was slow and uncelebrated, dependent on clerical accuracy and patience. Each elimination was documented, signed, and filed. Media interest flickered when anniversaries aligned with broader discussions about unsolved crimes. Reporters requested interviews, which the department granted sparingly. Statements emphasized facts without conjecture. The restraint frustrated some viewers accustomed to dramatic narratives, but it preserved the integrity of the case. Melissa's parents continued to attend briefings, listening carefully, asking for clarification, and expressing gratitude for work that often produced no visible progress. In 2003, a tip emerged from a former resident who recalled a man boasting at a holiday gathering years earlier, suggesting he had gotten away with something near the river. Detectives located the individual named in the story, now living in another state. Interviews revealed exaggeration and a desire for attention. Travel records and employment logs placed him elsewhere on the relevant night. The lead was closed, the documentation added to the growing file. The department's relationship with the state crime lab deepened as new testing options became available. Partial DNA profiles once considered inadequate were re-evaluated. The cigarette butt, previously yielding limited information, produced a clearer genetic picture under updated protocols. Still, there was no match in state or national databases. The result was both progress and frustration, a step forward without a destination. A parallel effort focused on behavior. Analysts reviewed known offenders active in the region during the mid-1990s, particularly those with histories of opportunistic violence. Patterns were compared, looking for overlaps in geography and timing. One name appeared briefly, then faded under scrutiny. Another was incarcerated at the time. Each possibility was weighed against evidence, not intuition. The town itself changed. A new shopping center replaced old storefronts near the river. Roads were widened and traffic increased. The culvert remained, maintained but unremarkable. Detectives photographed it again, updating records to reflect environmental changes. They noted that while the surroundings evolved, the access points and sightlines remained similar to those documented in 1995. By 2007, the Cold Case Unit adopted a practice of annual comprehensive reviews. Melissa's case received a fresh read by detectives not previously assigned, chosen to bring distance and objectivity. They questioned assumptions, revisited early conclusions, and confirmed that investigative steps met contemporary standards. No errors emerged that would compromise a future prosecution. Thanksgiving that year marked 12 years since Melissa's disappearance. The local paper ran a short piece, quoting a police spokesperson about ongoing efforts. The tone was respectful, acknowledging both the passage of time and the persistence of inquiry. Readers wrote letters expressing support, some including memories of Melissa as a classmate or customer. The letters were added to the family's collection, a quiet testament to a life remembered. A significant shift occurred in 2010 when federal grants expanded access to national DNA resources. The department submitted the cigarette butt profile to a broader system, one that included arrestee samples from jurisdictions previously inaccessible. The submission followed strict guidelines, ensuring compliance with privacy laws and evidentiary standards. Months passed without response. In the meantime, detectives pursued a narrower hypothesis centered on proximity. They examined individuals who lived or worked within a short radius of Melissa's root home. Utility records, rental agreements, and employment histories were consulted. The approach reflected an understanding that many crimes of opportunity involve offenders operating within familiar territory. One individual, a maintenance worker who had serviced properties near the river in the 1990s, drew attention due to overlapping schedules and access to a compact sedan. His background revealed minor offenses unrelated to violence. He was interviewed voluntarily, provided fingerprints, and consented to a DNA sample. The comparison did not match the evidence. The interview was professional, the conclusion clear, and the record closed. As years accumulated, the case benefited from institutional memory. Senior detectives mentored newcomers, explaining why certain avenues had been exhausted and why others remained open. The emphasis remained on facts preserved and opportunities ahead. Melissa's parents were informed of developments, even when those developments amounted to confirmations rather than breakthroughs. In 2014, a routine audit of evidence storage revealed that advances in touch DNA analysis might yield results from items previously considered sterile. With approval, technicians re-examined Melissa's clothing. The process was meticulous, designed to avoid contamination. Results identified several inconclusive traces consistent with secondary transfer, common in retail environments. None provided a viable lead. The department documented the findings transparently, noting limitations and preserving samples for future methods. The approach reflected a philosophy shaped by years of restraint. Detectives understood that over-interpretation could harm a case more than silence. Winter returned with familiar rhythms. Holiday lights illuminated streets that once held missing person flyers. For many residents, the case had faded into memory, resurfacing only when prompted by an article or anniversary. Inside the department, however, Melissa Carver's name remained active, flagged for periodic review and eligible for emerging tools. The breakthrough did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It emerged from policy changes that expanded DNA databases following legislative action. By 2017, additional profiles entered the system, including those from individuals arrested for nonviolent offenses decades earlier. The cigarette butt profile was automatically compared against the growing pool, an algorithmic process operating without expectation. When the notification arrived, it did so quietly, as an electronic alert indicating a potential match requiring confirmation. Detectives treated the information cautiously, aware of the stakes. They requested validation through independent testing, following protocols designed to withstand legal scrutiny. The name associated with the match belonged to a man who had lived in West Warwick in 1995 and relocated shortly after the holidays. The file moved from long-term review to active investigation. Detectives assembled a timeline for the individual, cross-referencing employment records, vehicle ownership, and prior statements. Each step adhered to procedure, mindful that the case's age demanded precision. The winter that had preserved evidence now framed a renewed effort, grounded in science and sustained by years of careful work. Detectives began by confirming the integrity of the DNA hit. The potential match pointed to Raymond Ellis, age 46 at the time of the alert, a former delivery driver who had lived less than 2 miles from Melissa Carver's apartment in 1995. Records showed he owned a compact sedan that year, later sold when he moved to Connecticut in early 1996. The relocation had been lawful and documented, offering no inference by itself, but the timing aligned with questions long unresolved. Investigators reconstructed Ellis's life during the winter of 1995. Employment files placed him on a variable schedule that included evenings. Pay stubs indicated work ended around 9 on several nights that month. Gas station receipts preserved through a loyalty program showed occasional late purchases near Melissa's route home. None of the facts alone proved anything. Together, they suggested opportunity without yet establishing action. The team sought corroboration through independent evidence. Archived witness statements were reread with Ellis in mind. The dog walker's recollection of idling headlights near the culvert around 10:30 gained renewed relevance. Traffic patterns were reviewed again, this time paired with Ellis's known routes. Analysts avoided confirmation bias, documenting each step and inviting peer review from outside the unit. Before any contact, detectives obtained a court order to collect a confirmatory DNA sample. Ellis was approached at his current residence, informed of the request, and complied without incident. The interaction was recorded, professional, and limited to procedure. The sample was transported under seal to the state lab, where analysts conducted a comparison blind to case details. The result confirmed the match with statistical certainty exceeding accepted thresholds. With confirmation in hand, investigators expanded the evidentiary picture. They requested Ellis's phone records from 1995, limited by retention policies but supplemented by billing archives retained for tax disputes. Calls placed from public phones near the river appeared on dates adjacent to Melissa's disappearance. The records could not place him at the scene, but they narrowed windows and reinforced proximity. A search warrant was sought and granted for Ellis's old storage unit, maintained intermittently over the years. Inside, Investigators found items consistent with long-term storage, including vehicle maintenance tools and boxes of papers. Among them was an outdated registration document for the compact sedan he owned in 1995, confirming the tread type noted in early photographs. The find was logged carefully, photographed, and returned to storage pending further analysis. Detectives interviewed former coworkers and neighbors from the mid-1990s. Memory had faded, but patterns emerged. Ellis was described as reserved, punctual, and prone to routine. One former neighbor recalled frequent late-night departures during winter, citing delivery shifts and side work. Another remembered a brief period of agitation around Christmas that year, marked by abrupt schedule changes. Statements were taken, corroborated where possible, and weighed conservatively. The medical examiner's report was revisited with contemporary consultants. They affirmed that the manner of death remained consistent with a sudden encounter involving restraint. The absence of sexual assault indicators aligned with a theory of opportunistic violence triggered by proximity rather than premeditation. The cold exposure timeline remained accurate. Nothing in the science contradicted the emerging narrative. Investigators prepared for a second interview with Ellis, this time under caution and with counsel present at his request. The session focused on clarifying his movements during the week of December 21st. Ellis acknowledged living near the river at the time and owning the vehicle. He denied any involvement and stated he had no recollection of Melissa. He offered explanations for late-night travel tied to work and errands. Detectives documented the statements without argument, comparing them later to records. The team assembled a comprehensive timeline that placed Ellis in the area during the critical window. They avoided overreach, acknowledging gaps and uncertainties. The strength of the case rested on the DNA evidence, corroborated by opportunity and consistency with preserved facts. Prosecutors were briefed early, reviewing materials with an eye toward admissibility. Questions were raised, answered, and documented. A grand jury presentation followed, conducted with restraint. Evidence was introduced sequentially, beginning with the discovery and moving through preservation, advances in testing, and confirmation. Expert witnesses explained methods in plain terms. The emphasis remained on reliability and chain of custody. The grand jury returned an indictment for murder, a decision announced without spectacle. Ellis was arrested quietly at his residence, transported, processed, and arraigned. Bail was denied based on the severity of the charge and the weight of evidence. The community learned of the arrest through a measured press release. Local papers reported the facts without editorializing. For many residents, the name was unfamiliar. For Melissa's parents, the news arrived with a mixture of relief and gravity. Pretrial proceedings unfolded methodically. Defense motions challenged the DNA evidence and the passage of time. The court held hearings, listening to expert testimony and reviewing documentation. The judge ruled the evidence admissible, noting meticulous preservation and validated methods. The ruling emphasized that age alone does not diminish probative value when procedures are followed. As winter approached again, the case moved toward resolution. Plea negotiations occurred within legal bounds. Prosecutors offered a plea to second-degree murder with a lengthy sentence, citing the strength of the evidence and the desire to spare the family a trial. After consultation, Ellis accepted the plea. In open court, he acknowledged responsibility without elaboration. The record reflected the facts, not emotion. Sentencing took place on a gray December morning. The court imposed a term consistent with guidelines, accounting for time passed and conduct since the offense. Victim impact statements were brief and composed. Melissa's parents spoke of their daughter's routines, her plans, and the years of waiting. The judge acknowledged the restraint shown and the diligence of investigators across decades. The aftermath was quiet. There were no marches, no extended commentary. Evidence was returned to storage or released as appropriate. The file was closed, its status updated after years of readiness. The culvert remained a roadside feature, traffic passing without notice. For the department, the case affirmed the value of patience and procedure. For the town, it offered a measured sense of closure. Records were archived with a final note summarizing outcome and sentence. Training materials were updated to include the case as an example of preservation leading to resolution. The cigarette butt, once a promise deferred, was documented as the link that endured. The winter that had concealed answers also preserved them, allowing science to speak when it was ready. Melissa Anne Carver's name appeared once more in the local paper, this time under a headline that avoided triumph. It stated simply that a 1995 homicide had been resolved. Readers marked the passage and turned the page. In homes where Christmas lights glowed, routines continued. The law had done its work, slowly, carefully, and within bounds, delivering an ending that was not loud but was final. In the months following sentencing, the case entered a phase familiar to those who have watched the justice system from a distance. Paperwork replaced patrol cars, and court calendars replaced search grids. The conviction was logged with state and federal registries, ensuring that the record reflected a lawful resolution grounded in evidence rather than confession alone. Prosecutors compiled post-conviction summaries, detailing the evidentiary chain and judicial findings, anticipating routine appeals common to cases resolved decades after the fact. Defense counsel filed a notice of appeal limited to procedural grounds, arguing that the passage of time compromised fairness. The appellate court reviewed transcripts, lab certifications, and preservation logs. The ruling, issued the following autumn, affirmed the conviction, emphasizing that diligence and transparency mitigated the risks inherent in delayed prosecutions. The opinion cited the meticulous documentation maintained since 1995, underscoring that time had not eroded reliability. With the appeal resolved, attention shifted to administrative closure. Evidence was cataloged for long-term retention in accordance with statute, while personal items were returned to the family. Melissa Carver's coat and purse, preserved for decades, were handled with care during transfer, each item logged one final time. The family chose private remembrance over public display, a decision respected by the department and the press. The town marked the end quietly. There were no banners or proclamations. A brief notice appeared near Thanksgiving, noting that an old case had reached its conclusion. The language was restrained, reflecting a community accustomed to measured words. Residents who had lived through the winter of 1995 recalled the unease of that season, now tempered by the knowledge that unanswered questions had finally been addressed. Within the police department, supervisors conducted an after-action review. The purpose was not celebration but instruction. Detectives examined early decisions, noting where caution preserved options and where limitations constrained progress. The review affirmed that scene control, evidence storage, and clear reporting were decisive factors. Training materials were updated to reflect the case's arc, emphasizing that patience and process can bridge decades. The role of evolving science received particular attention. Analysts documented how incremental improvements in DNA testing transformed a partial profile into a definitive link. The case became a reference point for grant applications and interagency collaboration, illustrating the practical benefits of sustained investment in forensic capacity. Importantly, the review cautioned against assuming technology alone solves cases, highlighting the foundational importance of initial preservation. For Melissa's parents, the season carried layered meaning. Christmas arrived with familiar rituals and a quieter sense of closure. They visited the courthouse to obtain certified copies of final orders, then returned home to prepare a modest holiday meal. Friends joined them, speaking of ordinary things. The absence remained, but it was no longer accompanied by uncertainty. Raymond Ellis began serving his sentence in a state facility, classified according to standard assessments. His intake file reflected the conviction and the court's findings. There were no extraordinary measures, no special treatment. The system absorbed him as it does others, guided by policy rather than notoriety. Periodic reviews would occur as required, each grounded in statute and oversight. The culvert off the narrow road remained unmarked. Town crews maintained drainage and cleared leaves as needed. Drivers passed without slowing. Investigators resisted calls to place signage, preferring to keep the site ordinary. The decision reflected a belief that memorials belong to families and communities, not evidence locations repurposed after closure. As another year turned, the department received correspondence from agencies across the country requesting information about the case. Responses focused on method, not narrative. The emphasis remained on what could be learned, not what could be dramatized. The restraint mirrored the tone adopted since the beginning, a through line connecting discovery, investigation, and resolution. The legal outcome stood firm through subsequent review periods. No new motions altered the record. The appellate decision became final, closing the door on procedural challenges. The certainty mattered, particularly to those who had waited through long winters for clarity. It also mattered to the integrity of the system, demonstrating that delayed justice can still meet contemporary standards. Community memory shifted subtly. The case was no longer framed as an open wound, but as a reminder of endurance. At Thanksgiving gatherings, older residents mentioned it briefly, noting how long it had taken and how careful the work had been. Younger residents learned of it through conversation rather than headlines, absorbing lessons about patience and accountability. The local paper published a year-end retrospective on public safety, including a paragraph on the resolved case. The piece avoided photographs and avoided language that might sensationalize. It acknowledged the investigators who had carried the file across generations and the scientists whose work had provided clarity. The restraint aligned with community values shaped by years of measured reporting. Inside the courthouse archives, the file was boxed, labeled, and placed among other resolved cases. The final entry summarized the outcome, sentence, and appellate affirmation. A notation indicated eligibility for future review only as required by law. The record was complete, its trajectory visible from first report to final order. Winter returned with snow and early darkness. Decorations went up along Main Street, lights reflecting off wet pavement. Life continued. The systems that had once mobilized to answer a question now rested, prepared for the next call. The case had concluded not with spectacle, but with confirmation that careful procedure, maintained over time, can deliver answers when conditions finally allow. Melissa Anne Carver's story remained one of a life interrupted and a community tested. It also became a testament to process. The evidence had waited. The science had advanced. The law had applied itself without haste or excess. The outcome, reached lawfully and verified at each step, offered a quiet form of closure that fit the town and the season. The winter secret had been carried forward, then resolved, leaving behind a record defined by care rather than noise. The final chapter of the record did not arrive with ceremony, but with routine confirmations that marked the end of a long administrative road. Certification of sentence was transmitted to corrections, appellate deadlines lapsed, and the clerk's office issued a notice of finality. The language was procedural, spare, and decisive. For a case that had lived for decades in careful margins, the closing entries were fitting in their restraint. In West Warwick, the rhythm of December returned with predictable regularity. Store windows filled with lights, traffic slowed near intersections dusted with salt, and the river carried thin sheets of ice along its edges. For residents who remembered 1995, the season once carried an edge of unease. Now it carried memory without the weight of uncertainty. The difference was subtle but real, felt in the way conversations ended without trailing questions. The department maintained a policy of post-closure communication with families, and Melissa Carver's parents received a final briefing outlining what would happen next. Records would remain accessible, evidence retained as required, and notifications issued should any legal status change. The clarity mattered. It replaced the open-ended waiting that had defined so many years with a defined horizon governed by law. Investigators who had touched the file at different points reflected privately on its arc. Some had been young officers when the case began, learning scene discipline in a winter field. Others had arrived decades later, trained on databases and lab protocols unimaginable in the mid-90s. The continuity between them was not personality or style, but adherence to procedure. The file showed it plainly, a line of care extending across time. The town's relationship to the case settled into a quieter form. There were no annual appeals now, no anniversary notices urging tips. Instead, the story lived as an example referenced occasionally in discussions about persistence and evidence. The shift was important. It allowed the community to remember Melissa as a person rather than a question. At the courthouse, archivists finalized the placement of the case among resolved matters. The process included a review to ensure sensitive materials were restricted appropriately. The goal was balance, preserving public record while protecting privacy. The decisions followed statute and policy, the same frameworks that had guided the investigation itself. For the prosecutors involved, the case reinforced lessons about early engagement and evidentiary discipline. They documented how decisions made in 1995 enabled admissibility decades later. The documentation informed training sessions and internal guidance, emphasizing that restraint at the outset preserves options later. It was a lesson learned through patience rather than error. Raymond Ellis's legal status stabilized into routine. Periodic reviews occurred as required, each documented and subject to oversight. There were no surprises, no deviations. The system functioned as designed, separating accountability from spectacle. The focus remained on the record and the sentence imposed. Melissa's parents chose to mark the season privately. They donated to a local scholarship fund in her name, one aligned with the community college she had attended. The gesture reflected continuity rather than closure, a way to fold her memory into ordinary life. The donation was acknowledged quietly, without press. Local law enforcement agencies across the region continued to exchange information about long-term cases. Melissa's file was cited not for its outcome alone, but for the way evidence had been preserved through changes in storage standards and technology. The emphasis remained on what could be replicated: careful logging, conservative interpretation, and readiness to revisit assumptions. Winter weather played its familiar role, complicating travel and compressing daylight. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. The culvert remained unchanged, a functional part of drainage infrastructure. The decision to keep it unmarked endured, rooted in a belief that places should not be burdened beyond their purpose once legal obligations are met. The local paper ran a holiday edition that included a reflection on community resilience. It mentioned the resolved case in passing, framing it within broader themes of time and patience. The language avoided adjectives that would inflate or diminish. Readers absorbed it alongside weather forecasts and store hours, the story integrated into the fabric of daily life. Inside the department, a final quality assurance check confirmed that all required notifications had been sent and logged. The case status in databases was updated to closed, with flags indicating resolved by DNA match and plea. The clarity mattered for future analytics and reporting. Precision at the end mirrored precision at the beginning. The broader impact extended beyond a single file. The case influenced budget discussions, supporting continued investment in forensic capacity. It also shaped policy around evidence audits, reinforcing the value of periodic reviews even when no immediate progress is expected. The lesson was institutional, not personal. As new years approached, reflections turned naturally toward the passage of time. For those who had carried the case, the resolution affirmed that diligence does not expire. For those who had waited, it affirmed that answers can arrive without drama. The distinction mattered, particularly in an era inclined toward noise. Melissa Anne Carver's name now appeared in records with an outcome attached, not an asterisk. The distinction was small on paper and profound in effect. It transformed how her story was told, anchoring it in fact rather than uncertainty. The change honored her life without extending harm. The law's role concluded as it should, having established responsibility and imposed consequence. What remained belonged to memory and community. The quiet that followed was not emptiness, but a steadier ground where routines could proceed without the pull of unresolved questions. The winter closed with familiar signs. Decorations came down, streets cleared, and schedules resumed. The case, once preserved by cold, had reached its end through care. The record stood complete, lawful, and verified. In a town accustomed to measured words, that was enough.